Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to CPSE's first sponsored webinar. Our speaker today is Daniel Haight, President and co-founder of Dark Horse Analytics. Daniel is a former researcher and award-winning lecturer at the University of Alberta. Daniel will discuss how to build a defensible strategic plan using analytics by Dark Horse Analytics. At the end of the webinar, please contact Dark Horse Analytics directly for any additional information, and be sure to visit their booth at the 2019 Excellence Conference, March 12th through 15th at the Hyatt Regency Orange County in Garden Grove, California. Daniel, it's all yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Cindy. So just a little bit of context before we jump into this. This presentation is considering like a fire master plan or an overall strategic plan for an organization. So the principles contained herein will obviously apply to smaller plans. So if you're looking for a particular area plan or a shorter term plan than a fire master plan, certainly it applies. So as Cindy mentioned, if you have any questions, please type them in. I'll try to keep an eye on the questions in case I can answer them as they come up. But I'll do my best to answer those at the end, if possible, if we can get to as many as we can. So I'll save a little bit of time towards the end of the presentation. Lastly, just a little more background on Dark Horse. We started out as a research institute at the University of Alberta back in 2000 actually. And did our initial work in some nearby fire departments and ambulance services. And in 2008, we spun out and became an actual company. So we've been doing this for coming on almost 20 years, and both from a research and a practical aspect. We're based in Canada, but we also do a fair bit of work in the US. So with that out of the way, let us begin. So one of the things we did back in 2016 was we queried and surveyed a number of fire chiefs, accounting for about 1/3 of the population of Canada. And we asked what their top strategic priorities were over the next 5 years. And two things came up. The first was how to acquire additional response capacity to deal with growing demand. And the second was dealing with the financial and performance accountability that seemed to be thrust upon them by their stakeholders. So on the one hand, you have a need to deal with the growth in demand for your service. And then on the other hand, you have a strong need to justify the resources that you're going to be adding in order to deal with this growth. So what this strategic planning exercise should do is to go into detail of how you would go about supporting your needs as a service in front of council members, city managers, county managers, and other stakeholders. One of the fire chiefs we spoke with had a very interesting quote. You can see it here. The fire chief of the future will almost have to be a statistician. You may know you're doing a good job, but you're going to have to prove it. And I think that's appropriate given that this talk is focused on how to use analytics to provide that extra support for your organization, particularly when it comes to strategic planning. And just some base principles before we jump into this full scale. I want to keep in mind that analytics is not some kind of a fairy dust that you can sprinkle on top of a strategic report to give it the magical power to convince stakeholders. Analytics is really, it's been around forever, and it just comes down to finding evidence to support your hypothesis or your theory or what you're contending for with your organization. So we have a few things that we think are kind of top of mind and really important in making any kind of planning exercise. So the first is to let the results of the analysis guide you. If you go into this with a preconceived idea of what you're going to show, and you're going to find the evidence to support what you've decided upon up front, it will become apparent. And we have worked on multiple projects where we were brought in either by a new fire chief or the city manager, because it was quite obvious that the prior administration or the prior group had not done their homework and had decided beforehand what they were going to do, and then they came up with the evidence to support it, and basically ignored the evidence that didn't support it. So at the very beginning of a strategic planning process, you need to have an open mind as to what does the evidence actually say, and let that guide your strategic planning effort. So that's principle number one. I already mentioned that analytics isn't fairy dust that you can sprinkle on things. I tell my students it's like baking bread and then deciding you wanted to bake a raisin bread, and if you just kind of take the bread out of the oven and poke some raisins into it with your thumb, it's not going to be very good bread. And you need to have the analytics as part of the process before it's fully baked. Third principle is to use the least amount of information needed to convince. So when you are, when you have an idea or you have a recommendation that you're putting in front of your stakeholders, you can't, the temptation is to overwhelm them with, and this also supports it, and this also supports it, and this, and this, and this. And at some point, you pass even diminishing returns, and it actually has a negative impact on your case that you're trying to make. And so what we try to do, whether it's the analytical evidence from the data or even the feedback or the qualitative evidence from engaging stakeholders, we try to find out or zero in on what's the minimum amount that is needed to convince the stakeholder. And you'll find that that's actually when they're most strongly convinced. They're at some point during the evidence presentation, they're going to be like, okay, yeah, this makes sense, this is credible, I believe this. And that's where you want to stop. Now, it's very difficult to know that, and I'll talk about how you can understand how much evidence is needed to do that as we get going into this. Principle number 4 is immaterial mistakes are material. And what I mean by this is you may be doing some analysis on your drive times or on call volumes or on the unit availability, and you have something that you've made an error either in your data collection or in your analysis, and that error is obvious to someone looking at it. It might be something as simple as, you know, we used the wrong filters when we were looking at a count of calls, and so a counselor or your city manager or county manager might notice, you know, last year you told us the total call count was 17,500, and now you're saying it's 17,100. What's the difference? Now that's immaterial probably with anything you're trying to recommend, but what you're finding, what you'll find out is that it has just undercut your credibility to a huge degree, so it becomes material. This is a case where perception is reality. If your stakeholders perceive that you've done sloppy work, that you have spelling errors or grammatical errors even that are immaterial to the recommendations you're making, they will begin to mistrust any of the evidence that you're bringing forward. And trust is hard to gain and it's very easy to lose. So you need to be ruthless in reviewing your work, in testing and verifying and quality assuring all the analysis that's done. Lastly, your stakeholders hate surprises. They don't want you to go off and work in a dark room on a strategic plan and come out 6 months later and then present it in front of the whole group and saying, here's our problem and here's how we're going to fix it and here's what we need in resources. They need to be involved with the process as you go along. And in order to help that, we suggest part of any strategic planning process, you need to do a stakeholder engagement phase in that process, and that should actually be the starting phase. So let me jump into the 4 major components of how to prepare a strategic plan, and they are as follows. So as I said, the first thing is stakeholder engagement. Contacting anyone who has the power to say no to your plan, but also those who are going to be impacted to a great degree by whatever you recommend in your plan. So the first phase that you should deal with in preparing for your plan is a stakeholder engagement. And I'll talk in detail a bit more about what that involves. The second piece, and these can run simultaneously, is benchmarking. It's looking for a cohort of comparable services to yours and finding metrics that allow you to compare yourself to them to see, are there areas where you are lacking? Are there areas where you're best in class? Are there areas where you need more resources? Thirdly is what I call a diagnostic analysis. So this is, again, part of the analytics of this, where you're looking at not only what happened in your service from your data, but why it happened. And this is particularly important in response performance or standards of cover, where you're looking at, okay, we have poor performance at night. Is it just because it's dark out, or is it because our crews have long turnout times at night, or is it because the calls tend to be in a location far from our stations at night? So that's what diagnostic analysis helps you understand. And then lastly is the predictive and prescriptive modeling. So diagnostic tells you what's wrong and why, and the predictive modeling and the prescriptive modeling tells you what's going to happen and what you should do about it. So I'm going to dive into detail in each of these, and we'll start by looking at the stakeholder engagement. I want to note that the stakeholder engagement is more of a qualitative analysis, and it isn't analytics per se, but the way you can summarize it is through the use of analytics, and we'll talk briefly about that as well. So stakeholder engagement, the first principle you need to keep in mind is that you want to cast a wide net. And you do this for two reasons. One, it's going to foster buy-in from those who are involved. As I said, your stakeholders don't like surprises. And if you start involving them in the process right at the start, they are going to be bought into that process. They're going to see their recommendations reflected in the strategic plan, and they're going to know that they were given a voice in shaping the strategic plan. It also will alert you to any potential problems. If part of your engagement is talking to your CFO or your city management or some of your other stakeholders who control the purse strings, and it becomes very clear that they believe you're overstaffed, or they believe that budgets are very tight, or that they have other priorities, if you know that early on, it will help you to shape your plan accordingly. Secondly, the second principle about stakeholder engagement is you're trying to understand how these outside groups and inside groups perceive your service. So you're talking to the union to find out, how do they view your training? How do they view your resourcing? How do they view communication between management and your frontline staff? You're talking to the police service. You're talking to neighboring services to find out their perception of your service. And if you get from multiple areas feedback that suggests that your crews are thought of as lazy, or you're thought of as disorganized, or you're thought of as being poor performing, that's really valuable information to know. And if you come into this with an attitude of, I want to learn what the perception is, and then the second, third, and fourth phases or the second and third phases of this preparatory process will help you understand where perception and reality are the same, and where perception and reality are not the same. That's one of the great outcomes that comes from stakeholder engagement. The second thing that'll come from engaging is that you will get great suggestions. You will have your union come up with an idea of, hey, instead of buying a second set of turnout gear, what if we put these washing machines in the facilities themselves? Or what if we outsource it to another crew? Or instead of having to buy a new truck, what if we instead repurposed some of these other trucks that aren't being used effectively? So you're going to get suggestions from your team, and a lot of these are great ideas that everyone thinks should be great ideas, and they think everyone knows. but you may not know of them or may not have thought of these. So just a potential approach of how it might look like. This is from one of the projects we were involved in. We did a combination of workshops and interviews. So if you're looking at senior leaders, like your CFO or the chief of police, you're going to want to do one-on-one interviews. If you're looking at talking to a broad cross-section of your crews and your teams, it's best to do those in work sessions, in workshops. So you're trying to get everyone from your rookies to your experienced firefighters to your battalion chiefs, trainers, admin staff, inspectors, etc. And you want to ask them a series of questions that help you understand how they perceive things. So some examples of what that might look like in the end, based on the information gathered from the workshops, nearly half of people say we are short of staff and equipment. Maybe more than a quarter see training as a top 2 or top 3 priority, et cetera, et cetera. So now I've taken all that feedback and I've synthesized it down to some very actionable things. So the stakeholder engagement has identified lack of resources and training and health and wellness as kind of top 3 problems. And when we start to look at benchmarking and our diagnostic analysis, ideally these should show up again. So we're getting the same types of issues and problems identified from multiple different angles. And that's what gives your stakeholders confidence that you're doing a good job of your strategic plan. And my last point on stakeholder engagement is to use professional facilitators. If you've never run a workshop before, don't just assign that to one of your firefighters who happens to be injured at the time. There's an art to doing this well, to engaging these people, getting honest feedback, getting the unspoken suggestions that everyone's afraid to talk about. You want to get those out. You don't want those sessions to be dominated by 1 or 2 people. And in your interviews, they will help you come up with the right kinds of questions that aren't just going to be touching the surface, but getting to the deep issues and the second and third level suggestions that will come from well-designed questions and interviews. So that's it on the stakeholder engagement. I want to talk now about benchmarking. Benchmarking is an interesting one. It can tend to be basically 2 things happen. Either you get the wrong cohort and you've kind of cherry-picked the group that you're going to compare against, and that becomes readily apparent to your stakeholders or to your audience. So it's really important that you choose the right cohort. And let me talk a little bit about how you can go about choosing a cohort. So this is from public data. We just pulled population from, I think this is about 40 or 50 services in North America and the population that they deal with. So you can see Toronto and Houston are the highest population cities, right down to Raleigh and Colorado Springs on the bottom. So if you're looking to find a cohort that is similar to Houston, you might say it's Toronto and Montreal. But if you look a little closer, you'll see that the density of Toronto, Montreal is very different than the density of Houston. Houston is much more similar to Calgary and Dallas than it is to Toronto or Montreal, which are near the top of the population density. So maybe you shouldn't be looking at just population to try to find a cohort that is similar to your own. Secondly, let's say we're looking to try to find a cohort for Vancouver. Well, Vegas and Portland have similar populations, and maybe we look at density and you find something else, but the service type is also important. So Vancouver is a fire-only service, but Las Vegas and Portland are both combined fire and ambulance services. So when looking at a comparison between the two, especially if we get more detailed, it's going to be more difficult, and it's more easy for your audience to kind of point this out and say, hey, there's no comparison between those two. They're completely different types of services. So by limiting your cohort set to amongst those that are just fire services, you have a reduced set, but you're getting closer to an apples to apples comparison. So now I'm looking at all the fire only cohorts, and now Vancouver looks close to Oklahoma City and Louisville. But if we again look at an incident count, it's a little bit higher than Louisville, which is near the bottom. It's still close to Oklahoma City, so maybe we're on the right track. But taking this another step further, if we looked at what I call intensity and density, you'll find that the closest comparator to Vancouver is actually Boston. The incidents per residence are very similar, so they kind of have a population base that is driving a lot of incidents, and then their incidents per square kilometer. So the density of calls and the density of the city that they have to deal with is again very similar. So we're trying to find those systematic or systemic issues and characteristics that are similar between your different cohort members, so that the cities that you describe are very similar. So again, your initial temptation is to say, well, Vancouver was similar to that, must be Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, maybe San Diego. But when you look at it closely, you know, the twin city or the dead ringer for Vancouver is Boston, and potentially Raleigh or something like that. So look at those similar structural challenges that you would have to deal with. Boston is a great example. It's surrounded by water, similar to Vancouver, so your mutual aid is going to be similar. They're older cities, similar density, and similar calls per resident. The second half of benchmarking is choosing the right metric. And this is where a lot of these offers fall apart. You've probably all seen these benchmark surveys that go out. They tend to be very onerous. You know, you've got a 20-page or 30-page document, and you're trying to fill out all these different questions. And at some point, you realize you need to hire full-time staff just to fill out these surveys. And if you don't go to that level of detail, you end up with, well, do I really trust the results from this? You know, have they even separated out the combined services from the, you know, fire-only services? And so you're trying to balance that effort versus value. And you're trying to, the way you do that is you choose metrics that it's very difficult to have wrong assumptions, and they're fairly easy for the service you're talking to pull up and to get to you for your benchmark study. I just have a question here I'm going to see if I can answer. So the question was back on the stakeholders portion. Can you offer any ideas of how to get the word out to stakeholders? So one of the things that we've seen used very well for dealing with stakeholders is social media. We know of a few fire services who use Facebook for internal communications. They've created Facebook groups for their staff that they can join up to, and they end up with, you know, 70, 80, 90% participation rate. So a huge portion of the staff joins it. It's a way for the management team to speak to staff on a regular basis about what's going on this particular strategic planning exercise. You know, what are our interim findings? What are we discovering? You can do polls using social media. You can have people vote on different things, and it's a fantastic way to communicate internally. We've also found Twitter and short video snippets to be really useful when engaging even a wider audience. So whether you're trying to engage potential recruits, you're trying to engage the wider population of your city or county, using Twitter, recording short videos or short blog posts is a great way, and a fairly low effort way to address your staff. And there are examples of services you're probably aware of that are best in class at doing this. And that's where I would suggest looking on communicating both internally and externally. But I want you to keep in mind that the communication needs to be regular, and there are tools you can use that'll even schedule out your tweets and schedule out your posts, and it needs to be transparent, and that'll be, if you can allow that two-way communication, it goes a long way to fostering that ongoing engagement. All right, let's continue here. So let's look at choosing the right metrics. In particular, cost is an interesting one. We pulled this data from public sources, the total budget for each of these services, and we're comparing it to incidents per resident. So if you look at a location like Denver, they have very high incidents per resident, but their cost per incident is fairly low. And that's kind of what you would expect. The more incidents you have, they're going to be kind of spread out over a smaller number of fixed assets and a smaller number of staff if your staff are busier. But what this does suggest is that Denver and Surrey and Vancouver are doing a pretty good job on a cost per incident. Now that doesn't mean that Ottawa and Calgary are doing a bad job, because they're very systemic issues or structural issues in both of those places. In Ottawa's case, they have a large rural area that amalgamates a number of municipalities together, whereas in Vancouver's case, their cost per incident is low because they do a large proportion of their calls are medical calls. But if you're looking at your stations and do you have enough stations, this one way to look at this is that station density. How many square kilometers or square miles does each station cover? And you can see again, Vancouver and Boston have a fairly dense station base. So it's a very small run area for each station. But the station busyness, the number of calls that they're dealing with for each station is very high. So Vancouver, again, being top of the list in the number of calls per station. And what's likely happening here is, again, they're probably having to staff up stations with multiple crews simultaneously, multiple units, response units, being available to respond. And this is a good metric to kind of see, if we have very small station zones, yet we are still very busy in our stations, it probably suggests that you don't need more stations, you need more staff in Vancouver's case. Whereas if you're Ottawa and you have very large areas that you're covering, or Louisville, very large areas that you're covering, perhaps it would suggest you need more stations to have a denser network to improve your performance. But this is just, think of this as one clue that's going to help build up that case and point you in the right direction. Some of the other metrics that you might look at, and again, I'm going to tie this back to that stakeholder engagement. If when talking to your staff, they say, we don't have enough training, we're putting our crews at risk, they're being put in the field too early, perhaps you, or perhaps the suggestion is that we're not responding quickly enough, we're not able to put out fires quick enough, and they're high risk. Maybe one of the metrics that you look at is civilian injuries per 1,000 residents. And so then you start collecting that information from your cohort that you're trying to compare with and find out, are we indeed similar number of injuries per 1,000 residents? Maybe your crews are complaining of burnout and stress, and then you look at a metric of incidents per operational staff. Are our crews doing 2 or 3 or 4 incidents per shift, where a typical crew is only doing 1 or 2 incidents per shift? If one of the complaints is training and equipment, maybe it's staff injuries per operation staff. And so a lot of these things will be reported, and this is where I go back to what I mentioned earlier. If you have a 20-page form that everyone is filling out, you're going to run into trouble. But if you can limit it to the 5 or 10 items that are showing up in your stakeholder engagement, so we know that training and equipment, burnout and stress, prevention are kind of issues that have come up in the stakeholder engagement. We can craft metrics that we can then ask from our cohort to do the benchmarking just on those that we deem to be important, as opposed to looking across at an extremely wide range of things. And one last thing to be aware of on the benchmarking is faulty comparisons. Again, I talked about different service types, but there are different policies. Some services send multiple runs to, or they send responses to all emergency medical calls. Some of them send it to only the highest priority emergency medical calls. Some send no fire trucks to emergency medical unless no ambulance can respond. Some services mistakenly count vehicle runs as incidents, and that's going to inflate their numbers. So you need to make sure that you're counting the same thing. Some of them include canceled calls and false alarms. Some of them don't include canceled calls and false alarms. So these are all items and issues that could come up when you're collecting your benchmark. And so sending out a simple survey often isn't enough. It's probably best to pick 3 or 4 or 5 similar cities from that cohort discussion, and then create a questionnaire that's based on your issues, and then talk them through the questionnaire so that you can answer any types of questions or ambiguities that they have about the exact data that you're requesting. And once you start to get that data back, look at it and try to understand why there are differences. If it looks like your staff are responding to way more calls than anyone else in a typical shift, does that make sense? Or why do you think that might be? And know that your stakeholders will also be asking those questions. And this is, again, those opportunities to make mistakes. And one of the ways to mitigate this is to invite those stakeholders, or at least a small subset of them, along for the process so that they can help you identify potential errors. So think of this as, we're creating this strategic plan together. 3 weeks into it, we're going to look at the initial results from the benchmark, and with the goal of trying to identify where it's an apples to oranges comparison. So now, instead of them trying to catch you in the act of making a mistake, they're bought into helping you identify potential mistakes and to fix them before it becomes your final report. All right, we have another question. The question is, do you have any recommendations for benchmarking mid-sized departments with small data sets, plus minus 1,000 incidents per year? As long as you're picking reasonably sized services, so 1,000 incidents per year is sometimes difficult to get enough signal in the noise, especially if you start cutting it into subsets. But you'll notice that a lot of the metrics I've talked about here are rate metrics. They're divided by the population, or they're divided by the incident counts. So if your population is 20,000 people, it doesn't mean you have to find other services with 20,000 people. But it might mean, staying with services with fewer than 50 or 75,000 population. So as long as you're dividing by or normalizing your data by the appropriate metric to form your compound metric, then you should be okay, even looking at smaller services. The only real danger is if you start to, so maybe you only have 1,000 calls per year, and now you're going to look at only your structure fires, and that's 700 calls per year. Oh, now we're only going to look at structure fires where we didn't send a response. And so you get that smaller and smaller subset, and trying to benchmark on that, you'll start to have huge fluctuations in the results that it gives you, and it can send you down the wrong path. Okay. I'm just going to give you a quick demo. We have a free benchmarking tool that we've developed to help with, at a high level, dealing with some of these issues. So what we've developed here is we collect 5 or 6 different metrics, And we've collected these from public sources, and they're things that are not easy to game or not easy to make the wrong assumption on, like population, calls, service area size, total operating budget. And then we've created a bunch of compound metrics. So you can see here, the first one is calls per person. The one we've entered for our Dark Horse Fire Department is right in the middle, kind of better than a third in calls per person or more than a third, but kind of in the middle of the biggest clump. You can look at the top here, we have Baltimore, and it's kind of the worst case scenario. It's worse than anyone else. It has almost 0.4 calls per person per year. And similarly, its calls per square mile is again pretty high. And so it's both a dense place and the population drives a lot of calls. Chicago, on the other hand, is even worse in their calls per square mile. And again, in their, sorry, I have to move something. In their calls per unit, they're very busy in Chicago. So you can use this tool. If you email us, you can and agree to share your data. You could see your service show up in here. So I can hover over Los Angeles, Detroit, Boston, Houston, and others, and see where they fit on some of these metrics. And we have a few more here. Some of the cost metrics, cost per person, who's the most expensive. San Francisco is a very expensive service to run. And again, there are good reasons. It doesn't mean it's a bad service, but it is certainly valuable in you understanding where your service fits, at least at a high level. And the tool is free. What we're hoping will happen here is that people will agree to share their data and to vet that data with others who have access to the tool. And we'll only allow names to be shown for those who have shared their data. We've kind of primed the pump a bit by putting some publicly available data in it. But the idea is every year that this would be up to date, and you would be able to see, at least at this level on some of these metrics, where your service fits. And then you might be able to use this as a way to find that cohort and of like similar services to yourself, and also to help you define your metrics more appropriately. All right, back to PowerPoint. I have a short video, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to show it all, but this is with one of the, Captain Badgery is with the Edmonton Fire Rescue Service. He used to be a council member for one of the municipalities in the region, and he's now a captain in the fire service, and he was leading the strategic planning to address a particular station that they were going to reactivate in one of the near downtown areas. And there was a lot of controversy around reactivating. It was right on the waterfront, on the river, and the neighborhood was not happy with it being reactivated. And so he talks a lot about some of the issues that came up, but I want to focus particularly on his recommendations on what are the three key things he thinks every planner needs to consider before starting out on a planning process. So I'll let you listen to Darren.
The most recent strategic planning initiative that we were involved with was the reactivation of Fire Station 21, which is located in our River Valley, just outside the downtown core. Three key items that we would suggest every planner have in the back of their mind when it comes to initiatives like this would be, number one would be communication is key. Communicating, whether it be messaging, intent, or the expectations of initiatives like this has to be consistent and timely. So communication would definitely be number one. So all of the stakeholders, including internal communications within the department, to make sure that all of our membership has the same message. Messaging within the neighborhood was crucial. We knew that it was somewhat contentious, so it was important for the community or the neighborhood itself to understand the expectations and what the response would look like from Station 21. And then messaging to the community, the greater community and council, to understand the impact and the importance of reactivation. Secondly, would be the development of performance measures early on in the process. Having an understanding of what we're trying to achieve, messaging that with the community and council is extremely important, and then being able to produce the data sets and the analysis required to get that initiative approved is, was key in this process as well. Number three would be the ability to adapt as the process goes along, especially when you have several different stakeholders involved. You have to expect twists and turns along that path, and the ability to adapt and take slight turns in the process and adapt the process is key.
All right. So just on that last point, again, I want to reiterate that the strategic planning process, don't think of it as a show and tell with a big reveal at the end. The process needs to adapt. You're going to get feedback. You're going to find data and information that leads you down different paths. And if you think of this as co-creating, then your mindset is the correct mindset. You're co-creating this with your stakeholders, and you're not bought into a railroad style design of creating your plan. So I'm going to talk now about diagnostic analysis, and this is where we get into the more heavy-duty analytics. Analytics itself has been around forever. There are many different types, or 4 major types, and if you Google what is analytics, you'll see a picture very similar to this. At the bottom left is fairly easy to do, not a lot of value, and it's just straight reporting. How many calls did we have? What was our performance? Where was performance high? What are our turnout times, etc. It just tells you what happened in the past. The second level is the diagnostic analysis, and it tells you why it happened. So instead of just saying, man, we have really bad performance in the Northeast, we would diagnose that and be able to say, we have poor performance in the Northeast because we don't have enough crews staffed there. Unit availability is the problem. Or maybe we have poor performance at night because downtown platoon 3 is very slow getting out of bed. Or maybe the station was poorly designed and the turnout times are bound to be long no matter how tired anyone is. So the diagnostic takes the what happened and layers on top of that why did it happen. And we believe that this is an important distinction, and one of the goals of our company was to create tool sets that help planners identify the why in their service. So I'm going to do a very quick demo. We've created a demo city called Gotham for those of you who are Batman fans. So here we have Gotham City. I'm just going to go to the events. We're looking at the last month, or sorry, the last quarter, the previous 3 months of data. Each of these little pins represents a station and its surrounding catchment area. You can see the run areas that they're responding to. And I can zoom in and out on the map to see my city, and I can see, yes, definitely downtown Gotham is the busiest. As I zoom in past the neighborhoods, I begin to see the data in hexes, and I can pull up, just by clicking on these, I can get an actual record of all the calls that occurred in that particular hex area, and I could zoom right into neighborhoods if I wished. So this shows me what's happening, but what I'm really interested in is why things are happening. So again, I have just under 17,000 calls. My performance is about 76% overall, and in certain areas of the city, right downtown here, I have 55% performance. Out here, I have 57. This area I have 91%. So why am I doing well in some areas versus others? And that's where we get into this over goal calls, where we plot all the calls you didn't get to in your NFPA target times. So you can see, yes, we have a huge number of them in our 3 downtown areas. But I'm going to click here on the filter on root cause. And this is the why part of the equation. So over time, I can see here by different times of day or at a high level, the majority of my problems are turnout. I have 1,100 of those in the last quarter that caused me to be late for a call. So I have some problems in my operations. But also the second biggest issues are distance and driving. So I don't have enough stations close enough, and proximity is my second largest problem. And then kind of thirdly is unit availability. So if I was looking to understand my service, I can use this tool to then zoom in on, okay, well, where do I have turnout problems? So I'm going to filter everything else out, and I'm going to look at the different regions of the city and where I have the biggest turnout problems. Well, it appears that Platoon B is a problem, lots of turnout problems there, and particularly in my downtown 3 stations. So if I zoomed in to my central station, and let's do that by selecting station 3. Now I'm just looking at the calls I didn't get to in station 3 and who's causing the problem. So it seems to be a problem with Platoon B in station 3, and I could click on the time intervals and it's going to give me the turnout times in station 3. And I will probably see that Platoon B is my problem. I apologize, the internet is a little slow here and I'm running out of time, but that's, oh, now I can see my turnout times. So it's 90% of the time less than 28 minutes total time, and my turnout times are about 2 minutes in that area. So let me jump back and just say this, that using a tool that allows you to diagnose the root cause is important. There are other tools out there that do that. If you have a skilled analyst, they can do this in Excel, they can do this in Tableau, they can do this in Click. Our tools are built specifically for fire and ambulance services to answer those why questions. And if you'd like to try them out, send us an email and we can set you up with a demo account. I'm going to go back to the presentation. You'll notice that I zoomed in on turnout times there. I think one of the things that you'll find is as you deal into the root causes, you're going to find it's a combination of resource shortages and operational problems. That your call center may be slow, your dispatcher may be sending the second or third closest vehicle when they should be sending the closest. Your turnout times may be slow. And you need to have part of your plan to address those operational issues by setting station-specific targets for your turnouts, by setting targets and meeting those targets in your call centers. And that's really important. And only then when you've added that in, can you start asking for, and we need a new station, and we need a new unit or two to bolster our unit availability. And that's going to be very important. I'm going to jump quickly through the predictive and prescriptive modeling. Predictive modeling tells you what's going to happen. This is particularly important when you're doing the long-term master plans. You need to know how your city is expected to grow, both in the number of people, which drives the number of calls, and in the locations of those people, which drives the number of stations you're going to need to be close to those calls. I'll give you an example here. Here is a city we worked with. The number of calls they had over an 8-year period or 7-year period looked like this. Slow growth, maybe 1,000 calls added per year. But then in the most recent 3 years, they've been growing by about 10%. So if you're growing at 10% per year, your service is going to double every 7 years, which is unsustainable. And if we had just looked at the prior 3 years and built our forecast on that, it would be pretty scary for council, and they would say, what's going on? So what we've found useful is to come up with a range in your forecast. In their case, we said The worst case is that this opioid crisis continues to grow, and we see a near doubling in calls over that 7-year period. The best case is that some kinds of interventions come in and we're able to go down to the pre-opioid crisis and solve that over the next 4 or 5 years. The more realistic is that we will continue to grow from that, and that our planning should be based around that. So forecasting is important. You don't want to plan your stations based on today. You want to plan your stations based on 30 years out. And doing that well is a bit of an art and a science. The other component of forecasting is spatially. You're not just showing how many calls we're going to have. You need to know where and where that mix changes. And I'll flex in between this one. And you can see slight changes in the color as we forecast. And that's typical for a service, is you won't, in general, you're not going to have growth in a completely new area. There are only going to be slight changes. A hotspot today will be a hotspot in 10 years. But there will be, if you know there are going to be some changes or new developments or densification, you need to incorporate that spatially. And that'll help you plan your station locations. So finally, I'll talk about predictive analytics. Prescriptive analytics. And this is where it really comes down to the recommendations and what you should do about it. I see I have a number of questions. I'm going to try to get to most of you at the end here, but if I don't, please send me an email and I'll respond to you as best as I can. If you're doing prescriptive and predictive modeling well, you should be able to put all of your interventions in a similar currency. So in this case, I know that if I improve my pre-arrival time by 4 seconds, it improves my first due performance by 1%. And if I improve it by 25 seconds, it improves my ERF performance by 1%. Similarly, if I add one position, if I just add one firefighter, it doesn't help first due performance, but it almost gets me 0.5% in ERF. If I add one apparatus, it doesn't help a lot in this particular case, but it definitely helps my ERF by quite a bit, over 1%. Similar for adding halls, moving halls, reducing the number of incidents through mitigation and prevention efforts, etc. So this is what prescriptive and predictive modeling should be able to tell you. And I'm going to do a very quick demo, again with our favorite city of Gotham. This is our second kind of major analytical tool. It's called deployment. And it allows you to both test and add new stations, new units, and crew members. So if we remember from the diagnostics, there are a lot of busy issues in the kind of museum area just west of the downtown. So when we look at the overgo calls, the calls we're unable to get to, we can see there's a bit of a space here and there's a bit of a space here. So let's say we added, actually, you know what, I'm gonna look, sorry, it was here where I was looking. So in this area here, there's a lot of dark purple. Those are calls we're not getting to. And there's not a station in that area. And if we were to look at the distance issues in our diagnostics, we would see that that area is high in distance issues. The way you deal with distance issues is you add trucks, or sorry, you add stations. So I'm going to add a station simply by clicking, adding a new station. And now what happens is by default, I've set it up to add a career station with 4 staff and 1 apparatus. Okay? What did that do to my performance? Well, it improved my drive time citywide by 2 seconds. It improved my performance by almost 1%, and it reduced the number of overgo calls by 1,000. I'm able to get to another 1,000 overgo calls. That's what it's done to my first unit performance. What has it done to my ERF performance? Well, it reduced the number of ERF calls that I wouldn't get to by about 1,000, just under 1,000, and again, performance by just under 1%. Now I could go in here and I could say, you know what, that looks great. I'm happy with that new station, but are there any other issues I should be looking at? So I'm going to look at my performance view, and I can see up here around station 32 that I have really poor ERF performance. It's kind of a risky area. And I have some budget to add some more people. So I'm going to add some more staff, just like this. If If only it was this easy. I've added 2, hasn't really done much. I have a 3rd one, doesn't do much. 4th, 5th, 6th. And then suddenly when I start getting close to adding 16 people, that's when I should see, oh, so they don't get access into this area north of there. So for some reason I can't get across the highway there. So now I'm like, well, maybe I can't add people there. I need to add those people somewhere else. So again, very easily you click on a new station and you say, I want to add here. I'm going to add people here, and I'm going to see what impact that has on my ERF response. So this tool allows you to test different solutions, do what-if scenarios, and then in the background, we can run optimizations. We can say, if you have 1 additional station to add, where should you add it? What's the best place? If you had to close 1 station or move 1 station, what station should you move and where should you move it to? And then you can play with this and interact with it by adding vehicles, by adding crews, by moving vehicles, by moving crews, etc. Just as simple as this. All right. The last piece I want to talk about is to make sure your plan succeeds. What do you need to do? Peter Drucker, famous management guru, said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have a great strategy if it doesn't become part of your culture. And by it, I mean analytics and evidence-based thinking needs to become part of your culture. And the way that works is this very simple continuous improvement loop. You diagnose the problems, you you predict what's going to happen, you prescribe what you're going to do about it, and then you monitor it. And the tools we've created allow you to keep this continuous improvement loop going. This is part of the implementation that you build out for your service. So we have our diagnostic tool set that allows your analysts to identify which areas are too busy in the city, which platoons in which stations are having issues with their turnout times. Then we have the predictive modeling. What's your city going to look like in 10, 20, and 30 years? Then we have the prescriptive module. Which changes should you make that will have the most impact? And then finally, I didn't have time to demo it, but we have a dashboards tool that is really to kind of broaden the adoption of analytical and evidence thinking throughout your organization. And so that's the final piece of the puzzle that ties it all together. So that concludes my presentation. I have a couple questions I'm going to try to get to here. If I don't get to yours, please email me and I'll respond to those. The standards, the question was, what standards do we use? We try to convince the services we're working with to use the NFP 1710 or 1720 standards. Some of them like to use kind of custom standards for themselves, but we strongly recommend people use the NFPA standards just to allow interagency comparison. Makes it much easier. What tool is utilized to validate the information obtained is indeed valid? Probably 80% of the effort we spend on any project is cleaning and validating data. If any of you have ever gone down this analysis path, you know that there are all kinds of issues. There are button press issues when people arrive on scene or leave the quarters. Sometimes people game the system. There's a whole lot around data integrity and quality assurance. We help services set up that QA system, and we do it for them when we do the engagements, and we automate a lot of that data cleaning. And then finally, we use analytical approaches that are less sensitive to erroneous data. And I'll give you an example. If you take an average time for your scene time, and perhaps someone didn't book off when they returned a vehicle, pulled it out of service, you might have a 3-year scene time. And if you take an average, that's going to move up your average scene time by several days. Whereas if you take a median or 90th percentile, it will have very little effect on it. And then the next question was, how do we define performance? Again, we're using the NFPA 1710. What percentage of calls are we reaching with the first unit in the target time? Or what percent, or what is the percentage of time that the 16th person arrives on scene in the low-risk NFPA target time. So we've reached the end of our time. Again, if you would like advice on planning, you'd like a copy of the slides, you'd like to learn more about the services we offer, or you want to try the free benchmarking, just drop me an email. There's a lot of resources on our site you can get access to, and we're not the type of company that spams you. You need to sign up if you want to receive blog updates. We have a number of blog posts that can help you get started on this as well. Thanks for your time, and we wish you all the best.